This is Greg Harmon of Deceleration.News, an online journal speaking to our shared ecological, political, and cultural crises, seeking out the roots of human and planetary insecurity, movement beyond resistance in pursuit of a sustainable peace. So this is part of a series of podcasts we're doing dedicated to San Antonio's climate action and adaptation plan, a city effort to rapidly reduce our climate pollution while preparing our residents for rapidly escalating extreme weather being brought about by fossil fuel-driven human industry and agriculture. This week we speak to structural engineer and green building leader Bruce King about the opportunities that climate change poses for cultural change, as well as the potential of the building trades to play a leading role in cooling our overheating planet. Thanks for joining us. My guest this week is Bruce King, who has spent 40 years as a structural engineer working all over the world, specializing in alternative building materials, founder and director of Ecological Building Network, and author many times over in the sustainable building field, titles such as Buildings of Earth and Straw, Making Better Concrete, Design of Straw Bale Buildings, and the most recent, The New Carbon Architecture, Building to Cool the Climate. Bruce King, as I'm sure you're aware, there's a real struggle going on these days, and I think for the within the environmental or really across broader culture, as we're faced with these colliding ecological crises. There's sort of I'm hearing in news circles that I'm not used to, a sort of fatalism, a language of doom that it's new, at least not to all my contacts, but certainly to some kind of more mainstream voices. Do you feel, first of all, that doom or that is warranted?
Well, yes and no. I think it's widely acknowledged that it's far too late to prevent climate change. It's clearly happening and manifesting in all sorts of different ways, as are readily evident if you're watching or paying attention. But whether you have to respond to what's happening with gloom and doom or in some other way is sort of up to you. It's natural enough to feel despair and grief and rage over what's happening. But as my friend Paul Hawken put it, you can decide that everything is happening to you, or you can decide that everything is happening for you. You can choose either point of view.
Right.
And many have opined that, at least pointed out the possibility that climate change, along with all the other calamities that happen in our lives, personal and collective, is something that's happening to wake us up. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that can be dismissed as so much New Age drivel, and it can be investigated as an interesting possibility that shifts the whole conversation. At the very least, for me personally, and many people I know, it gives me some energy and some vigor to carry on the work that I do to try to reverse this calamity that we have created and turn it back around. And I prefer to do so with joy and energy and compassion rather than a sense of gloom and doom, because I don't think I'll ever actually accomplish very much in a feeling of gloom and doom or of fight and all the martial imagery that we tend to use, fighting climate change and winning the battle and so on.
There's a very militaristic language about kind of identifying an enemy, and waging this war on global warming and all of that. And I'll tell you, as a kind of recovering journalist, certainly. Boy, you write these stories over and over again, whether it's global warming, habitat destruction, biodiversity collapse, everything that's going on in the oceans, and you think, wow, just more information will create that action. Where I think it's really the language of transformation that creates movement, perhaps, and I think that's why your book caught my attention, and I wanted to give it a nod and encourage folks to come out and hear you talk when you're here in San Antonio, because it's really, I think, is widely understood that carbon sequestration is imperative to reach certainly the goals of the Paris Agreement. And in San Antonio, I'll tell you, as we work our way, we're finally getting a climate action plan here, and working through that. There's a breakout kind of energy and buildings group that is focused, interestingly, almost entirely on energy. Whether it's how much it'll hold, how much release, building codes, eventually reaching Z&E code for new buildings in like 2040, I think. But when it comes to carbon sequestration, I was checking the list today, and this is on our kind of working community member measures. Defines that as, quote, plant materials, soil restoration, and all high-tech solutions. So building specifically hasn't found its way on our radar. Is that typical, do you think, for most cities kind of pursuing these sort of agendas?
Yes, it is. People haven't woken up too much to both the challenge and the opportunity that buildings are. Even the green building phenomenon that has arisen in the last 20 years and become a bit of a odd juggernaut is pretty much all about operating energy, what we call operating energy versus embodied energy, or operating carbon emissions versus embodied carbon emissions, meaning what it takes to run a building while you're using it. While we're sitting here with our laptops and the lights on and maybe some air conditioning going and all the things that make a building, keep us comfortable. The embodied carbon is what it took to get the building there in the first place.
Right.
And as we unpack that and start to unpack the notion of the time value of carbon, which I can explain in a minute, and I will explain in my talk, it turns out that if you're building something today, the climate impacts of your project, more or less, are mostly due to the embodied carbon, not the operating carbon, which is the reverse of what everybody's been thinking all this time. Over the next 20 years, 3/4 of your climate impact comes from the embodied carbon, not the operating carbon, and that really is flipping around what everybody understood, because we'd always looked at buildings from afar over their whole lifetime. And over the 60 to 100 years of the average building, a house, an office building, a school, the operating emissions, the energy it takes to run it over that period of time, dwarfs the embodied energy or emissions. But we're not so much worried about 60 or 100 years. We're not even sure the building will still be used for that long.
Right.
We're worried about the next 20 years. This is, get to work time and take every advantage we can. And then from that perspective, it's the embodied emissions that actually matter the most. And so a lot of what I'm doing, along with many of my wonderful colleagues and co-authors of this book, is getting the word out that embodied emissions matter, and there are relatively easy ways emerging by which we can do so. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then the notion even starts to arise of not just reducing the harm we cause, but actually doing something positive and turning the built environment into a gigantic carbon sink.
Right.
It is, after the largest construction of humankind. And if we could make our buildings out of plant matter, basically, which we're starting to do in all sorts of novel ways, we could let Mother Nature do the work of pulling the carbon out of the air and turning it into usable fibers and so on, and then make our buildings that way.
Right. Well, it's
a simple concept, excruciatingly difficult in execution sometimes, but nonetheless, that's already happening.
Yeah.
All over the economy, all over the world.
Yeah, and I want to ask you about that. I've been kind of it's been interesting here watching the process of the climate planning, where San Antonio, we own our electric and gas utility, we own our water utility, and are therefore in a really unique position to make pretty. You would think we'd be able to move quickly, as we see the market moving and the price on renewables, collapsing and all the rest. But it's been funny to watch as the savings, or when we talk about mitigation side of this climate plan, when it comes to turning off the coal plants, it's a it's kind of a subdued conversation compared to buildings. All the energy from the plants themselves on these spreadsheets actually materialize in buildings, right? So when you talk about embodied carbon, if we can kind of turn the valve down on what's causing, the buildings to kind of light up red, which is the coal and gas emissions that are powering them, it seems like that would be the big footprint.
Well, yes, but what my work is about, is parsing that down a bit, because yes, we're running coal plants every day and natural gas power plants to keep the lights on and to keep people comfortable in the intense heat or in the cold and so on. But we're also using them to run the steel plants and the cement plants and the various other plants, or the embodied side that makes our materials. And actually, that's where most of the action is in the near-term future. Is in the embodied carbon of buildings is almost, well, to a very large extent, it's in the materials that we use to make them. And of those, most of them are structural materials. That's why my background as a structural engineer comes in handy here. So if we can focus in on those low-hanging fruit, you might say, targets, then we can have a big impact on embodied carbon. My project, I have a grant to write a climate-friendly concrete building code, because concrete is by far the most commonly used building material in the world, and it's the biggest
villain,
because of the Portland cement that we use to glue sand and gravel together to make concrete. And nobody's done that yet. It's kind of surprising to me. There's all sorts of green building codes and standards like LEED and others that say it'd be a good idea if you didn't use so much cement, but they're really sort of vague and not compulsory, not something that a building official could enforce as part of a building permit. They're just good ideas and not even required to get the LEED certification. We here in the Bay Area, where there's been a lot of great progressive work on concrete in the structural engineering community and the concrete ready-mix suppliers here, have all done a lot of work and found that we can drastically reduce the carbon footprint of concrete without sacrificing quality or adding cost. And so we're now going to write a building code that will be adopted in a number of the counties around the San Francisco area, but written in a way that will be in the standard language of building codes all over North America, so that other people can adopt. I'm starting to get phone messages piling up.
Super.
People know about it, want to borrow off of it, and so on. So
yeah, that's great news. Our fourth and fifth largest emitter, for San Antonio, these are cement batching plants, and I was looking at them, to getting a little closer view, and I noticed one of them, the one that's locally owned, Texas owned, actually does have what they advertise as kind of like a lower carbon cement line, which I had never heard of before. And so that was a new area of inquiry for me.
Well, yeah, I'd be curious to know what that means. Over the last few decades, the American cement industry has transitioned from so-called wet process to dry process, meaning you're dealing with dry materials, not wet ones, and so it takes a lot less energy to cook them up to the temperature you need, and that's all very good. It greatly improved efficiency, and that was all driven by economics. It was cheaper to run. The Chinese have taken it another leap forward. Their cement plants, at least many of them, are 100% more efficient than that, far better than American plants, and that's a good thing, because the Chinese make about 60-70% of the world's cement. Yeah. The Chinese, what's the number I saw? The Chinese poured as much concrete between 2010 and 2014 as all of the USA did in the 20th century.
Wow. Yeah.
That's how fast they're moving. And for those of you listening who haven't been to China and traveled there, as I have, it is mind-boggling. No matter how much expectation might get raised, it is mind-boggling what's happening in China. We're little villages. One day are cities with high-rise buildings.
Mega cities, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's just stunning.
I had an opportunity years back to interview Bijoy Jain, architect out in India, and outside Mumbai, I guess, is where he practices, and he kind of like you looks first to really local materials. You talked about building with straw and mushroom and clay, and definitely that's kind of like that's where I began to encounter that. I mean, I've been in straw bale homes and adobe, and San Antonio itself, was at a certain point, jacales and adobe homes. That was how we lived here before, the German, European wood, and then we start seeing these wood structures. And so there's a lot of opportunity. I have to give a shout out to Esperanza Peace and Justice Center, which I believe in a couple of years ago brought in the first adobe to San Antonio, certainly to the west side in a century, and it's really amazing to see and to walk through. But I also noticed that that in the book there's a chapter dedicated to wood, and that that I think the quote was "wood like never before." And I'm wondering if you can speak to that.
In the past, just 10, 20 years, we have developed ways to work with wood that we never had before. Computer-aided design, computer-aided manufacturing, fast-setting glues, and so forth. And what many people are familiar now with, certainly plywood and oriented strand board, but also glue-lam beams, where you take a bunch of 2x4s or 2x6s and glue them together and press them, and you get a big beam from a whole bunch of small pieces of wood. Well, that concept's been extended now and expanded to where we can make bigger glue-lam beams, we can make bigger sheets of plywood, and in fact, we can make entire floor slabs out of cross-laminated timber, using more or less the same principles. And so we can harvest small trees, or out here in the West, where I live in, tens of thousands of trees are dying in the drought or beetle kill, but would still be harvested, have usable fiber, and should be harvested to reduce the fire danger.
Kind of the understory or
slabs. So we have all sorts of ways we can build with wood now that we didn't before. And so if you're going more than 3 or 4 or 5 stories high, you now have another option besides steel or concrete. Up until recently, I, as a structural engineer, would tell you can only build it with steel or with concrete. And it's kind of a funny distinction, because no matter which one you say you choose, you're going to have a lot of steel and concrete in it. There's a lot of rebar in a concrete building, and there's a lot of concrete in the foundation of a steel beam building, and so on. But those were the only materials we thought we had. Now we can go, and the Europeans and Australians are going 10, 20, 30 stories high with all wood structures.
And the impact then, just within the industry itself, harvesting the wood, you're describing kind of areas that maybe need to be cleared, whether it's understory or forests that have been kind of ravaged by the pine beetle or whatnot. This is still, we're able to maintain or grow more mature forests while increasing a reliance on timber?
Well, you won't be surprised to hear that it's a pretty complex situation.
Sure.
But the short answer, as best I can give it, is that as I set out to write this book, I knew that the promise of mass timber construction, as it's called, was cool, because you could then build a large building and it would be sequestering more carbon. It would be sequestering carbon rather than emitting it as a concrete or steel building. Concrete and steel are the 2 biggest emitters in construction, the 2 of the biggest in the world, period. And to build with wood instead of concrete or steel means it's an absorber, not an emitter. Okay, so the question then arises, to anybody who thinks about it, is, well, what's the effect on the forest? Does that mean you can just go out and cut willy-nilly and have all wood buildings now and it won't have a bad impact on the forest? Well, no, it's not quite so simple. But I asked an old buddy of mine, Jason Grant, to write a piece on sustainable forestry. He's been an activist for sustainable forestry for decades now, and a very effective one, with the Forest Service Stewardship Council and with the Sierra Club and all sorts of people. His credentials are impeccable. And I asked him to write about that. What would be the impact of rapidly scaling up old construction? And he was energized by the process. He said he learned a lot. He drew in his whole network of people. All sorts of very lively email conversations ensued. And the gist of it is that, yes, we could do this. We're not on track to do it now. Right now, we're still not basically practicing good forestry in most parts of North America. Mm-hmm. But it's possible. We could do so.
Mm-hmm. And as you described some of the changes, I mean, speaking from you're in San Rafael, California, is that correct? Yeah, and so when as you speak to kind of like changes that have been able to been enacted out there, whether it's the cement industry or others, here we are in Texas we're in probably the builders lobby. Builders and realtors represents the most powerful lobby in the state. How does the work going on where you are and others practicing sustainable building and creating this new vision, how does that sneak its way into Texas? You mentioned codes that maybe go into kind of universal codes.
Well, again, that's a complex and interesting situation. I don't know how I could summarize it. Of course, from the perspective of a Texas builder, I might just be a crazy California hippie and dismissed at that and so on. But, for example, with concrete, the gist of making low-carbon concrete is to use less Portland cement, which is where the emissions really are, mm-hmm. and use more of other things like certain industrial byproducts that you can use to replace cement, like the ash from a coal-fired power plant or the slag that's left over from making steel. There's all sorts of ways to make low-carbon concrete, which it turns out to be better concrete, and by just about any measure. Even the American Concrete Institute, I was just reading their missive from a couple of months ago saying, a pure cement concrete is a thing of the past. It's a museum piece and a bad idea. And it was telling it to stop specifying minimum cement contents because it's a bad idea. But also, just aesthetically, would you rather live in a concrete building or a wood building?
Right.
I mean, come on, get real.
Right.
You want to look at steel or concrete or wood all day.
That's what I was going to kind of suggest is that, the change really only comes from a kind of a groundswell, kind of cultural interest and demands on the purchase side or top down on a policy side, and that takes really kind of an economic argument. So there's two ways that I guess that this could move here anyway, and a city like Georgetown, Texas, going 100% renewable because it just made economic sense. Do you see possibilities in this area?
Well, for sure, with buildings, I mean, earth and building makes just a bucket of sense in a place like Texas, or I was just in Tucson, Arizona, another place. And even in Tucson, it's harder to make work because they don't have the diurnal temperature cycle like you do in most parts of Texas. It doesn't cool down very much at night in Tucson,
right?
Which is kind of key to using passive thermal conditioning. But you don't have earthquakes. Earthquakes really complicate things, especially when you're building with a heavy material like earth. And you don't have earthquakes. You have hurricanes and you have some horrible humid heat. But for you, the argument is so compelling to just live in a comfortable adobe. It's very often in my profession, the architects and builders I know, especially as we travel and read, we see that if you look at the indigenous architecture of your area, what people were doing before the Industrial Revolution, it may not be something that you want, but there's at least going to be elements in it that have been honed over many, many generations of living there that work. They're there because they work for your climate and your wind conditions and rainfall patterns and all of that stuff. I was just reading this sad story about how a lot of those homes that Brad Pitt built in New Orleans after Katrina, with absolutely the very best of intentions, of course, they're falling apart. from the looks of it, it looks like he fell in with the Starkitects, with the big name architects, and they designed fancy things, and then they were built by the lowest bidder in some typically horrible construction process, and so they're rotting and falling apart and being demolished or at least abandoned.
Wow.
It's a shame because I'm pretty sure that Brad Pitt meant really well and tried to lend his good name and celebrity to a very decent cause, but and I'm afraid it's not by any means an isolated case. I worked in Haiti for a while and I saw the same thing. Mm-hmm. Really good intent, just blowing up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is a shame. And what your comment, Adobe, is noted. There's certainly a lot more work being done in this area, and compressed block, companies popping up, and it's interesting even out in Big Bend National Park. Texas is 99% whatever privately owned, but we do have an amazing national park out in the far west corner of the state. And there's an old hakal down there that this fella. One thing I think that makes it unique is that he dug it down into the ground, so it sticks and it's mud and it's everything else. But he lived there for decades. He lived to be 109. He had 40-some children, not all of them while living in this home. But you're absolutely right. I mean, they work. We know that. So there's a lot to be taken from that and recovered. But the one thing that really has always struck me when I see or tour a straw bale or adobe home is just oftentimes you see a real whimsy. People take the building materials and make it their own, and unique curves and design. Which makes me think of just the idea of biomimicry, in design and in architecture and where it appears, and I'm just wondering if you have a thought to when we stopped being inspired by nature in these ways.
Well, there's a big one.
Yeah, it's not small, but it's something that the creativity, the creative impulse of being part of the earth, wanting to live in that pulse, I think is really important.
Well, yeah. Well, we our buildings have increasingly been isolating us from nature, and that's in part just because more and more we live in cities. We passed a tipping point 10 years ago or so. Mm-hmm. More than half of humanity lives in an urban area, and that proportion is now increasing. And by just about any measure, that's a good thing. It lowers people's personal ecological footprints. It provides more opportunity for women and children, mm-hmm. for healthcare and education and opportunity. So cities are cool and should be embraced. That's why that's kind of what I try to focus on. Really artistic and creative single-family homes out in the countryside with curving walls and all sorts of stuff. It's really fun, and I've seen 1,000 of them, and I love it. But I'm just not that interested because it doesn't hold promise for the broader world's population. It holds promise for a relatively very small demographic.
Right.
And I'm interested in the poor farmer who's moving to the east coast of China and has to find a home in Shanghai or Beijing, or the blacks and Latinos in every American city, mm-hmm. Or you name your poor worker group who can't afford a quarter acre in the country and to build their own home. Mm-hmm. It's kind of the intersection of social justice and environmentalism, I suppose. But I'm just interested in how do we house all the people who are coming. Ed Masvia of Architecture 2030 estimates that we're going to build so much in the next few decades for the coming few billion people that basically going to double the building stock that is currently on Earth will be doubled in the next 30 years. Mm-hmm. That's jaw-dropping. I mean, it won't happen in San Antonio or San Francisco. It's happening in China and India, basically.
Mm-hmm. And yet, even in the cities, though, there's a...
They're not going to be, lovingly crafted, curving walled adobes. They're going to be multi-story apartment buildings and such. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean they can't be inspired by and use effectively the principles of natural building, using local resources, using human ingenuity using carbon-absorbing materials and so on.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, it's certainly all a part of kind of renaturing the city, and we're seeing it here. A lot of our drainage ditches are now living waterways again, and I do see it, and the work being done in buildings that reflect that as well. So, but I want to plug kind of your lecture. There's an opportunity for folks to. On the 11th of October, ask you far more insightful questions than probably I've brought. But you'll be speaking at San Antonio College, is that right?
Boy, I don't remember offhand. I could pull it up and look, but
okay,
that's right. Yes,
I'm pulling up the website myself. But yes, Thursday the 11th, AIA San Antonio, the Earth and Construction Initiative. Are bringing you down, and what would you like to? What kind of areas would you like to see that conversation go in?
Circle back to where we started. Mm-hmm. Climate change isn't happening to you; it's happening for you. Mm-hmm. How might that look? Is that just a stone hippie fantasy from Northern California, or is that maybe a new possibility for yours and my life? And I'm actually advertising the talk as the story of carbon, because the more I think about it, and as I was writing this book, I was thinking, well, what carbon? It's not a bad thing. It's just we're increasing the amount of it in the air.
It's in the
still
wrong
far less
right.
under the air we breathe.
Right.
Far less than 1% of the air that you're breathing right now, and yet it has this effect. It definitely having this effect that's not so good for us and a lot of the other creatures. Mm-hmm. But we're made out of carbon. Right. I'm talking with a carbon mouth, and you're listening with carbon ears, and so on. And so I call it the story of carbon, because I'm trying to see it in the context of life on Earth and how we evolved and where we are now and where we might be going. Mm-hmm. And climate change is certainly the big thing of the moment, but it's entirely possible that with some sort of technological breakthrough or with artificial intelligence, which is I'm both wary of and excited about. Mm-hmm. Solving climate change may turn out to be, no big deal. It'll take us 3 weeks now that we've got this figured out, and boom, there it is. I kind of doubt that. I'm not the kind of person to just say, technology is going to fix everything. Mm-hmm. But I also recognize that there's a whole lot of surprises in store that we just can't possibly anticipate from our current point in time.
Right.
So I'm both gravely concerned about the state of the world and profoundly excited. What a time to be alive. Mm-hmm. What a time to be alive. Oh my God. It's just it's just sour and unfortunate, the political schism of the country right now, because I don't think the average Donald Trump supporter is all that different than me, who is not one. If we could sit down together in a room and all of that, we'd still have our differences, but we still love our children, and we still like to eat good food and have a good time, and so on and so forth. We're human beings. Mm-hmm. So why so much hatred and anger? I'm not quite sure what the deal is, but I do see beautiful things happening that you don't read about in the newspaper, that don't make the headlines because they're not headline-y.
Right.
Fear and terror and scary make headlines, and people doing good work in the community, people turning a drainage canal into a park, mm-hmm. doesn't make the news too much. Mm-hmm. People organizing to, support undernourished children in the schools. All these little things, these tens of thousands of little things that people take on, mm-hmm. are so beautiful, and we just don't hear about them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I agree with you. And sometimes, it takes a shift like we're seeing right now to kind of like push people into action and to spark creativity and spark engagement and commitment to community and thinking of community beyond the human one. So, and they're great conversations we have. A lot of people out there doing good work, and yours as well. I wanted to recognize that in a small way. And Bruce King, thank you very much for speaking with Deceleration.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Deceleration is a joint effort of myself and my wonderful partner, Marisol Cortez. And we blog, write, every once in a while at deceleration.news, and every once in a while throw out one of these podcasts. But we'll be trying to do a little bit more as San Antonio pushes through with his climate plan. A great opportunity for community dialogue. See you next time.